Welcome to the debate. Imagine a United States with, well, no Senate, no Supreme Court to strike down laws, a mandatory 32-hour work week, and, completely open borders.
Yeah, for some people, that sounds like an impossible utopia. And for others, it sounds like guaranteed collapse.
Exactly. But this isn't some abstract thought experiment. We're looking at the literal 2025-2026 program of the Democratic Socialists of America. It's titled Workers Deserve More, and it was released in the wake of a second Trump victory, an event the document views as a total catastrophe for the international working class.
Right, and it lays out this sweeping, completely unapologetic blueprint for basically tearing down the American political and economic system and building something entirely new in its place.
It really does, and I think it demands we ask a very uncomfortable question. Do you try to salvage a system that has undeniably left millions behind? Or, do you completely dismantle the constitutional and economic bedrock of the country to save those people, even if the sheer shock of that transition might fracture the very coalition you're trying to build?
And that's exactly what we are digging into today. Because to me, the DSA's program isn't just radical for the sake of being radical. I mean, it's a highly logical, highly proportionate response to a status quo that has entirely failed the working class. I'll be taking the side that incrementalism is dead, and this structural blueprint is the only way forward.
And I'll be arguing that while the material benefits they propose are deeply appealing, their overarching, radical, structural maximalism actually undermines the pragmatic viability of the whole project. Okay, so let's jump right in. Look at the diagnostic reality the text presents. You've got millions of people working themselves to the bone in dangerous conditions, yet they can't afford housing. They can't afford healthcare or, education.
Right. The basic cost of living is just completely detached from wages.
Exactly. And why is that? Because those basic human needs have been commodified. They are controlled by billionaires for profit. And the program points out, I think incredibly accurately, by the way, that the current political binary forces Americans into a terrible choice.
You mean between the far right and the corporate center left?
Yes. You either choose a far-right movement that is actively attacking civil liberties or a corporate-backed center-left that, well, mostly just funds massive military budgets and protects elite donors.
Yeah, the text is very sharp on that critique.
Right, so tweaking the margins, a tax credit here, a slight regulation there, that has definitively failed. So demanding a new democratic constitution with a single legislature alongside total public ownership of major industries, it isn't extreme. It's actually the baseline requirement for survival at this point.
Well, I don't disagree with the diagnosis of the pain at all. When the text talks about establishing a 32-hour work week with no reduction in pay, or implementing Medicare for all with zero premiums or copays.
Which would be life-changing for millions.
Oh, absolutely. It is speaking directly to very visceral, very real economic anxiety. But, you have to separate the desired destination from the vehicle they want to use to get there.
How so?
Well, when the text demands the abolition of judicial review or replacing the entire two-party system with a single federal legislature, you aren't just changing policies. You are literally unplugging the life support of the current republic and just, hoping the new machine boots up before the patient dies.
But the current machine is already killing the patient.
I hear that, but combine those systemic shocks with their maximalist foreign policies, like completely demilitarizing the border and ending all immigrant detention overnight, you build a platform that I believe actively pushes away the exact broad working-class coalition required to win elections and actually enact any of those material gains.
I see your point on the political risk, but I'd argue that the material gains you just mentioned, they are structurally impossible under the current machine. Let's dig into the actual mechanics of economy for the working class section.
Sure.
They
aren't just making a wish list here. They pair that 32-hour work week with a severe wealth tax on the richest earners, massive inheritances, and for-profit corporations. And they explicitly design a massive public investment to fund a Green New Deal.
Right. And they make a point to guarantee support for fossil fuel workers during that transition, which is vital.
theoretically. But I have to ask, how does that level of wealth extraction actually work without collapsing the very industries that are currently employing those workers?
Well, because it fundamentally changes how capital flows. Think about our current economy like a thick sponge resting in a shallow pool of water.
Okay, a sponge. I'm with you.
Right, so capital acts like capillary action in that sponge. It naturally, relentlessly pulls the resources upward, away from the foundation of labor, and it just pools at the very top.
Where the billionaires are.
Exactly. Incremental tax tweaks just try to squeeze a few drops back down, but the physical laws of the sponge just keep pulling it back up. The DSA text is saying, look, you have to change the physical structure of the sponge itself.
And that's where the public ownership comes in.
Yes. That's why they demand full public ownership over major transportation, energy infrastructure, natural resources. You have to remove the profit motive entirely so the resources distribute laterally to the people doing the actual work.
Okay, it's a really striking image. But, if you're listening to this and you've ever dealt with a massive centralized government bureaucracy.
Oh, here we go.
Now, really, think about your local DMV or the VA hospital system. You are probably wondering how that exact same state apparatus is going to efficiently manage the entire continental energy grid.
But that's not what they're proposing.
Well, I completely support the platform's push for localized direct worker power. They want to protect the right to strike, make it vastly easier to unionize, heavily fund the National Labor Relations Board.
Right. Putting agency on the shop floor.
Exactly. That puts agency directly into the hands of workers. But mass state ownership? The text demands the government subsume the largest corporations. How does replacing a private corporate monopoly with a state monopoly guarantee operational competence? Especially because managing a transition away from fossil fuels requires really rapid, localized technological agility. And historically, massive federal bureaucracies are the exact opposite of agile.
Wait. I think we need to define what public ownership actually means in this context, because you're equating it with the DMV, which is frankly a chronically underfunded administrative office under capitalism.
It's still a state agency.
Sure, but the text links public ownership directly with democratic control. We aren't talking about handing the keys to a faceless Washington bureaucrat. We are talking about removing the quarterly profit mandate from systems that dictate human survival.
Okay.
Look at what happens when a private energy grid fails during a winter freeze or heat wave. It doesn't fail because the engineers don't know what to do. It fails because maintaining winterized surplus capacity wasn't profitable for the shareholders.
That's a fair point about the profit motive.
Right. So a democratically controlled grid operates on a completely different metric of success. It's about resilience and human need rather than stock dividends.
I get that. But just removing the profit motive doesn't automatically instill administrative precision. The mechanism of democratic control over a national supply chain implies this level of consensus and, flawless logistical execution that is incredibly difficult to achieve at a continental scale.
It's definitely a massive undertaking.
And this exact problem, the sheer, staggering administrative burden of running a fully decommodified economy, is what forces the DSA to propose such a radical restructuring of the government itself.
Exactly. That's the whole point. You cannot execute an economy designed for working people using a constitutional apparatus designed by 18th century aristocrats to protect private property.
Right. So let's look at the mechanics of this new democracy they want to build, because some of their proposals are pretty standard progressive fare.
Like replacing the Electoral College with a national popular vote.
Yeah, and ending the Senate filibuster. We can debate those all day, but they are firmly mainstream ideas. But then the text demands a complete dismantling of the checks and balances that essentially define the republic.
They are going for the root of the issue.
They want to establish a single federal legislature based on proportional representation and heavily limit, if not completely abolish, the Supreme Court's power of judicial review.
Let's pause and actually explain what that looks like, because it's critical for the listener to grasp the scale here. A single federal legislature with proportional representation means abolishing the Senate entirely.
Completely gone.
No more getting 2 senators whether you are Wyoming or California. If a working class party gets 40% of the national vote, they get exactly 40% of the seats in this new single chamber. It is pure,
unfiltered democracy.
Unfiltered is the perfect word, actually, because it removes the filter that prevents majoritarian overreach.
I don't see it as overreach. I see it as actual representation.
But if you consolidate all state power into one legislative body and you remove the Supreme Court's ability to strike down unconstitutional laws, you are building a hyper-efficient machine for governance. But you are doing it with the incredibly dangerous assumption that your side will always be the one driving it.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this argument. Are you saying we need to preserve judicial review to protect minorities?
I'm saying we need it as a guardrail.
Because the text explicitly points out that the Supreme Court currently uses judicial review to create and abolish laws outside the legislative process. And usually that's to the detriment of vulnerable people.
I know they cite recent rulings.
They cite the overturning of Roe v. Wade specifically. The court removed half the population's bodily autonomy against the will of the legislative majority. The guardrails you are defending are currently functioning as a weapon used by a reactionary minority against the working class.
Well, I'm saying that removing judicial review means a temporary majority can pass literally any law without constitutional pushback. Given that the text itself was written in response to a second Trump victory, a far-right majority is a highly plausible scenario.
Only under the current electoral rules.
But if they win a proportional majority in your single chamber, there is no Supreme Court to strike down their bans. There is no Senate to slow them down. You have essentially handed them absolute unchecked power.
But you are assuming the voting base remains the exact same. The DSA's constitutional overhaul also fundamentally redefines who gets to vote.
Right. The suffrage expansions.
Yes, look at their definition of universal suffrage. The program demands extending full voting rights to non-citizens, to people with criminal convictions, and establishing statehood for Washington, D.C.
That is a massive, massive expansion of the electorate.
It is, and the current constitutional structure, with its extreme deference to states' rights for election administration, inherently blocks these expansions. If we agree that a truly democratic society requires the most marginalized voices, like immigrant laborers and the incarcerated, to have a say in the economy they are physically building, how can you defend a constitutional framework that was purpose-built to exclude them?
Because proportional representation in a single chamber without regional representation creates a completely different kind of exclusion.
What do you mean?
The Senate, for all its immense, undeniable flaws, forces geographical compromise. Without it, you risk severe regional polarization or massive urban centers entirely dictate the economic and environmental policies of rural agricultural regions.
I think a working-class agenda bridges that gap, though.
But even if we assume this new single legislature functions perfectly, which is a huge assumption, we have to look at what they are actually trying to legislate. This is where the structural maximalism hits a massive pragmatic bottleneck.
You're talking about how the thriving working-class communities agenda interacts with their working-class foreign policy.
Precisely. Let's look at the domestic guarantees for a second. The text promises Medicare for all, universal rent control, high-quality multi-income social housing, tuition-free public higher education, canceled student debt, expansive paid family leave, and universal child care.
Which forms a cohesive, profoundly moral vision. I mean, it essentially guarantees the baseline physical and educational requirements for a dignified human life. It takes those things off the private market so they can't be held hostage for profit.
And it is a beautiful moral vision, truly. But then you pair it with the freedom of movement section.
Right.
The text demands allowing workers to freely migrate between countries without restrictive immigration controls. It calls for demilitarizing the border, ending all immigrant detention and deportations, offering immediate amnesty regardless of status, and crucially, providing immediate access to jobs and all of those domestic social services to all immigrants.
Because the DSA correctly recognizes that the working class does not stop at the U.S. border.
I understand the internationalist perspective.
You cannot build a socialist utopia in one country while relying on the exploitation of the global South. Ending economic sanctions on countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran, which the text identifies as literal economic warfare, by the way, is part of this same anti-imperialist stance. Immigrants are often fleeing conditions created by U.S. foreign policy.
And ending economic sanctions aligns perfectly with an anti-war stance. I absolutely agree with that. But the practical, logistical compatibility of completely open global migration with guaranteed domestic social housing, free college, and universal health care, it creates an incredibly severe resource tension.
I will admit, the logistics of funding and scaling that infrastructure simultaneously is daunting.
Very daunting.
But why do you view it as an insurmountable breaking point, rather than just, a massive challenge of resource allocation? We currently allocate nearly $1 trillion a year to the U.S. war machine.
True.
The text demands we gut that budget and redirect it entirely to human needs. If we tax the billionaires out of existence and defund the military, the capital is absolutely there.
Because you are dealing with finite physical constraints, not just financial ledgers. Even if you redirect the entire military budget, you cannot 3D print 1 million nurses overnight.
Well, obviously not overnight, but
Building quality social housing takes time, physical materials, land zoning, and labor. Expanding hospital infrastructure takes a decade per facility in some cases. If you have this new single legislative body trying to manage a newly nationalized energy grid, while simultaneously dismantling all border controls and guaranteeing immediate access to comprehensive social services for an uncapped number of global migrants, the physical system will buckle.
you think it would collapse?
The math of infinite demand and finite time-locked supply just doesn't work.
But that argument relies on the capitalist narrative that treats migrants merely as consumers of social services, basically viewing them as a drain on a static pool of resources.
It's not about being a drain. It's about sheer volume versus physical infrastructure.
But the text explicitly argues that immigrants are workers. They are the people who swing the hammers to build the social housing, who staff the hospitals, who harvest the food. When you expand the population, you are expanding the productive capacity of the state.
In the long run, yes.
The DSA program states very clearly that culture wars and anti-immigrant framing are artificial tools. They're used by right-wing movements to pit workers against each other and divide the class.
And I completely understand the theoretical solidarity there. But practically, how does a single federal legislature manage the sheer velocity of immediate, uncapped global migration into a system where housing and healthcare are decommodified state guarantees?
By mobilizing the workforce.
But if the state cannot build that social housing fast enough to meet the combined domestic and global demand, which it realistically cannot, scarcity remains. And when physical scarcity occurs, the working class consensus fractures. The very people you need to support this multi-party democracy will abandon it if they can't get a doctor's appointment or a home because of logistical overload.
I'm just not convinced by that because it assumes the state's capacity to adapt is inherently sluggish. A mobilized, unionized workforce under a Green New Deal, backed by total public investment, has historically achieved massive infrastructural leaps.
Give me an example.
Look at the industrial mobilization during World War II or the original New Deal. When the profit motive is removed and the goal is pure production for human need, the capacity of labor is just astonishing.
But the New Deal occurred within a highly restricted immigration environment, and it was executed within the familiar, albeit strained, constitutional checks and balances of the U.S. government.
True, but it still proves the capacity is there.
You're proposing a New Deal multiplied by 100, managed by a completely untested, single-chamber government that has no Supreme Court oversight, while simultaneously erasing national borders for labor.
It's a bold plan.
That is an unprecedented experiment in statecraft. It risks pragmatic failure because you are bundling highly popular winning economic policies like the 32-hour workweek with constitutional and border policies that terrify the median voter.
But the text explicitly critiques the entire concept of the median voter strategy. The program points out that center-right Democratic elites spent years embracing conservative immigration policies and prioritizing military funding just to chase this mythical median voter.
And they lost ground.
And it completely alienated the working class. Relying on pragmatic, middle-of-the-road tactics to defeat the far right isn't working. The DSA isn't trying to capture the median voter of a decaying system. They are trying to activate non-voters and unite a massive, multiracial working class into a political movement that changes the world. You don't do that by promising a slightly better version of a broken machine.
And my counter is that you cannot activate and unite a broad movement if the blueprint for your new society demands that everyone agree to completely dismantle the familiar mechanics of their government, their economy, and their borders all at the exact same time. The sheer volume of systemic shock is just too high.
Well, as we reflect on this, my view remains that the bold, systemic transformation outlined in the 2025-2026 DSA program is the only adequate response to the cascading crises we face.
We definitely agree on the scale of the crises.
Right. From proposing a single federal legislature to demanding the public takeover of the energy grid, the document correctly identifies that a system built to let billionaires profit off of human suffering cannot be reformed. It has to be replaced. The climate crisis and the rise of an authoritarian far right require structural maximalism. Tinkering has failed.
And my stance remains that while the material diagnoses of inequality and workers deserve more are incredibly sharp and accurate, the prescribed cure carries astronomical risks.
The risks of shock, you mentioned.
Exactly. Bundling deeply popular economic policies with the total dismantling of constitutional checks and balances, alongside the logistical paradox of open borders with universal domestic guarantees. It just demands too much all at once. It risks fracturing the coalition before it can ever secure power.
Yet, despite our profound disagreement on the mechanics, I think we both agree on the underlying diagnostic truth of the text. The current political binary is deeply unequal, and there's an urgent, undeniable need for policies that provide robust material support for working families.
Oh, absolutely. The identification of the pain, the stagnant wages, the housing crisis, the complete lack of control people have over their own lives is undeniable. Our attention is entirely about the mechanics of the solution.
And that is exactly why examining these foundational questions is so vital. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about our own appetite for risk. If the system is truly failing, do we accept the massive human cost of moving slowly and safely?
Or do we accept the immense, unknown risks of tearing it down to build something just?
Exactly. There is so much more to explore within the Workers Deserve More program, and we leave it to you to consider where that line should be drawn. Thank you for listening.